Afternoon. It's a couple of minutes after 1, so I think we will go ahead and get started. It's nice to see you all after a heavy lunch on a second day in the afternoon, and we're going to do our best to keep you awake and stimulated and learning while you're in here. So I'm Cindy Wiles, and I'm the director of Restore Hope, which is an organization that assists churches in polycentric sending. And so if you're not familiar with that word, maybe you'll become familiar with that word, and we'll explore more of what that means. And so I'd just like to open with a word of prayer if I could. Father God, we just come to you, Lord, just so thankful for all that we've absorbed and learned and experienced and the many dialogues that we've had over these couple of days. And Lord, right now I just pray that you continue to open our hearts and our minds to hear from you, Father, and to consider the ways that you're working in the world, Father, and the call that you have upon your church. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Pass this around by the end and just fill it out with everybody's attendance.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So, we're going to be today exploring polycentric sending from a church-based perspective. How many of you are familiar with that word? Are you familiar with it? Okay, so a few, and if you are here representing a church, then perhaps it's something that you may be even participating in and you don't even know it. So, but when you hear the word polycentric, what kind of thoughts come to your mind? Poly meaning? Multiple, many, and so several years ago, maybe the last 15 years or so, this word emerged. And it really is more of an observation than anything else as we watch, as the church watches, as mission organizations watch to see how God is working in the world. And this term was created, making a shift out of what we would consider modern missionary types of era, the modern mission movement. We began to just observe the ways that things had shifted in the world. The global south, of course, we've had a lot of conversation about the growth of Christianity in the global south and the mobilization of the global south and the diminishing of Western involvement in some ways in terms of effectiveness in the world, the way the world has changed, and we face limitations in ways that we have perhaps done things historically in the past. And so what we begin to observe is how much of the effective mission in the world was actually being accomplished by others in unique ways. We've also seen huge people migrations, placing people that at one time or another might have been inaccessible to us or in places where it was not easy to share the gospel and to proclaim. Now we see those people, because of multiple reasons, moving right to our very doorstep. And we ask the question, so how are they to be engaged? And so that's kind of the conversation we want to have today, but we particularly want to have it from the church perspective. And so how does a church respond to it, and how does a church participate in what we would call polycentric sending? So we want to kind of pick that apart and ask, what does that mean? Back some years ago, there were multiple people who tried to define polycentric sending, and it's been described as sending from everyone to everywhere. It's been described as sending from everywhere to everywhere. You know, if you can think back on your own childhood, how many of you grew up in the Southern Baptist context? Yes. And so when you thought of missionary sending, what came to your mind?
Mary Hill Davis.
Mary Hill Davis, Lottie Moon, white people crossing salt water to go to other nations, and from Western nations perhaps, and that was kind of our idea when we thought of missions sending. But as I said, what we've seen God doing is raising up witnesses, disciple makers, disciples who make disciples really literally across the world, and many of them doing it much more effectively and efficiently than we can. And so let's just think about this term. What does it mean to send polycentrically? You're familiar with this model. That's what we're discussing. Churches sending out. North American churches sending out global workers to live as gospel witnesses around the world. And so that's what we're familiar with. That's what we've done. That's what we think of when we think about sending, is equipping Many times we think about sending them to an agency, or for the Restore Hope Network that we're in, churches that are sending. I know Mr. Limley's church has been a sending church. And so churches sending out from the North American context. But what we've seen so much lately is, because the world has come to us, that there are many times that the peoples that live within our own community context are available to hear the gospel and experience the life-changing effects of the gospel. However, there's really not, for us as Americans, we're unskilled in how does that really occur? What does that look like? And so we're going to see and hear of examples today of what it means for a church to intentionally send in, to bring someone from the outside, an indigenous witness, perhaps from another nation, and bring them into the North American context, or identify them within the North American context and intentionally send them to work within a people group within the U.S. Another, I would say for us as a sending network, what we've observed so much lately when we look at the effectiveness of our work around the world is that the most effective work is sending within. And what we mean by that is when, and I'm speaking to North American churches, which is why you could leave North American churches out of this and talk about this generically, but since we are North Americans talking about how do we equip our churches to do that, if you could imagine North American churches coming alongside and empowering indigenous believers to spread the gospel within their own people group. And so I would say for us, we are literally seeing thousands and thousands of people among unreached peoples coming to Christ because churches in the U.S. are supporting and assisting with the sending in of workers within their own peoples. And then the idea of sending near. And in this model, North American churches help send gospel witnesses to bear witness of Christ among similar cultures. And what I mean by that is that there are cultures that are related in various ways, whether by culture, by language, by proximity, maybe even by religion, that have an ability to cross over, witnesses of Christ may cross over into another culture with much greater ease, drawing a much less attention to themselves and opening up opportunities for witness and the gospel in those contexts. There are going to be multiple speakers in this dialogue today, and so I'm just kind of doing a little intro, and then you're going to be hearing from actually two field workers who have direction over these types of workers that are working around the world. And so you'll be hearing from Megan Key. These are all Baylor grads except for me, so I'm the odd one out. Megan Key, who is a graduate of Baylor, working as a field director over East Africa and parts of Asia. Cameron Lecrier, who is a graduate of has a master's from the School of Social Work here at Baylor, and who has a background in international community development and is the field director over West Africa and parts of Europe, particularly Arab work in Europe. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Sam Goff, and Sam is also a Baylor graduate, and he has grown up internationally in South America with the International Mission Board, and then served with Food for the Hungry and food sustainability work worldwide and in East Africa. Eventually served on a church staff here in Texas, and then came to us in the last couple of years. And so you're going to hear from some skilled practitioners about how some of this works out on the field, and looking at some specific case studies to help us get our mind around embracing what God is doing through polycentric sending. So in terms of our conversations with our churches, I know that church process can be slow, and a lot of times we use terminology and we use language that has meaning and historic meaning attached to it. And so when we say the word mission within our churches, or missionary, or mission sending, whether we like it or not, there are ideas that come into the minds, and people believe they know what you're talking about, whether they actually do or not. And so sometimes having those channels open for them to receive new information, to consider new models, or to be very deliberate about how some of these transformative types of changes take place, it may take some repetition and education and re-education and conversation on our part in order to help churches move from where they are to where they need to be. And so as we begin this conversation, I just made a little list of what I think is required in order for churches to embrace the call, the acknowledgement of what it means for God to send witnesses from everywhere to everywhere. First of all, it's just awareness and acknowledgement. Like I said, I think sometimes they're so programmed to think one way, to acknowledge one model, that when you begin talking about that God is working in new and unique ways, it sometimes takes giving example and sharing information over and over and over again to help them open their minds to the ways that God might be working that they haven't considered, and certainly haven't considered how the church could be connected to that. And so another requirement, I think, for healthy polycentric sending is intentionality. And what I mean by that is you have this influx of peoples, whether they're in your community. We live in the DFW area. There's a huge influx of nationalities, and Cameron's going to get specific on some of that data here in a few minutes. But it amazes me, even within the leadership of our city. I can remember a couple of years ago being on a city council meeting for the city of Arlington, in which we were considering the placement of a large outdoor music venue in Arlington. And one of the proposed nights for that was an international music night. We happened to be in Pasadena as we were having this conversation at a Levitt Pavilion of this type in Pasadena, and it was Indo-Pac music night. And there were literally thousands of Indo-Pac music appreciators, most of them in their cultural attire, who had come to the Levitt. And I remember our city council conversation, the Arlington City Council, talking and saying, we don't believe that an international music night in Arlington would be effective because nobody would come. And I looked at them and I said, what Arlington do you live in? Because that is not the Arlington I live in. And it was interesting how those who had grown up and been leaders within that city were blinded to and didn't have the ability to even perceive the diversity of nationalities that were within their own downtown city center. Huh?
You don't have any Nigerian barbecue.
we have a lot of diversity. I think we are classed as one of the. I think we're the second. We may have moved to fourth this year, most diverse cities in the United States. That takes into account more than just ethno-linguistic diversities. It's other type of diversities, but it's extremely diverse. So we have the University of Texas campus, UT Arlington, right downtown, with about 52,000 students, most of them international. And so, just the blindness that was there. And so, but it takes real intentionality to consider how do we take the gospel to these people, because we make assumptions about them. We assume that because they came here and they're wearing clothes like the other students at UTA, that their worldview is the same as our children and that they've enculturated in some way, when in fact our approaches to them need to be just as intentional as they would be if they were in their land of origin, their home of origin. It also takes a commitment to best practice and effective practice. And I say this because I've seen, and I've watched it over and over again, churches and networks and agencies who experience a tremendous amount of effective evangelism and church planting work that occurs internationally. And the temptation in that is to just fuel the fire of that with money. To begin just throwing what we consider resource on the fire without taking the time to really develop the kinds of effective collaborative partnerships, relationships that are required in order to have effective best practice. What are they actually teaching out there? Just because something is growing doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthy. And so weeds grow as well as wheat. And so, being careful about that and ensuring best practice, even in a situation where we can come alongside and fuel work that's being carried out by others worldwide. Fourthly, trusting in God and others. And so while I say commitment to best and effective practice, I think the balance of that is trusting in others and releasing. We've heard all the little phrases about, Western dominion and missions. We live by the golden rule. He who has the gold writes the rules. This idea that because we possess knowledge, and money, we may be funding the program, we may be sending the workers. There are all kinds of ways that we as American churches struggle with releasing control. We also don't. It's not easy sometimes for us to embrace things that don't have a center. And what I mean by that is when you get into networking, particularly networks of church planters and systems that are flat, and all control doesn't pass through center. We don't have control over everything. We have to learn to trust God. Not only do we have to learn to trust God, but we've got to learn to trust others, and not just to trust others, but to empower others to lead and to be the front face of things, and to diminish and perhaps maybe even visibly disappear in some ways in order that effective mission and ministry can go on. At the same time, while we trust, it's important that we remain accountable, and that we expect others to also remain accountable. So I would say forms of accountability are important. It may not be possible for you to get all, I loved yesterday listening to Chris Clayman speak, and he'd say, well, the data on this is really fuzzy. Well, we don't really know. This is really blurry. And you expect Joshua Project to have all the right numbers and answer, but the truth is sometimes it's hard to get right numbers and right answers. But as much as we are able to be accountable and to expect others who partner with us to be accountable in ways that are reasonable. And lastly, the last thing I'll mention before passing this off to Megan is we've got to be creative. Yeah. Somebody asked us yesterday, so how do you get money into there? A very difficult place in the world. Or how are you achieving that? By what means and what by methods are you able to do what's happening in this place or that place? And the truth is, there's got to be creativity. Yeah. Creativity of thought. God's a creative God. And he's to live into our God image, we too have to be creative. And I'm constantly saying to the finance people in my office, okay, so maybe the answer's not a flat yes, but it's not a flat no either. So why don't you, if you can't do what I'm asking you to do, then can you go and figure out some other way to achieve what needs to happen in order for us to be a part of supporting a particular worker or ministry internationally? And so creativity in our methods, creativity in our access. How do we get into places credibly? How do we send near culture, same culture people, and provide access into communities that have been closed, into among peoples that are closed? What 2 new types of ministries have to be developed in order to have access to people? Creative funding. I'm always getting, people always send me these great ideas about ways to, that our people out there can raise money through TikTok. I don't buy into everything, but what I realize is that I am a skeptic, and that there probably are some really good ideas that I may need to investigate and explore in order to be effective. So with that in mind, we're going to do some case studies, and so I'm going to pass it off to Megan, and we're going to kind of look at each one of these and talk about ways that these things might be achieved.
Well, while we do want you to leave here today having adopted a polycentric missional model, I'm going to go back to what you're perhaps most familiar with starting out, and that's the send-out model. And so this is traditional mission sending of North American workers out to the world. And it's the most prevalent model historically that has been used to fulfill the Great Commission. And it's Restore Hope's still predominant method for mission-based sending, what we have the most experience in and what we are currently doing with most of our workers. But if we look at the Lausanne report from 2024, there are 135,000 U.S. workers living abroad. And so this still is a very prevalent mode of missional sending. And the U.S. church is still called to the nations. So when we are told in Acts 1:8 to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, that call does still exist for all churches across the world, including U.S. churches. And so it's still a very valuable aspect of polycentric sending. So when you're thinking about your church engaging in sending out, how do we establish a sending out mindset within our churches? Begins with a Great Commission DNA. And so what I mean by that is leadership within the church, whether it's pastoral or elders, deacons, mission committee, a Great Commission DNA that says we are called to everyone, everywhere. And so that includes our community, that includes our state, our nation, and yes, that includes to the ends of the earth. And along with that is providing opportunities to encounter and to engage the nations. So as Cindy said, she was working with a council who had no idea of the nations at their doorstep. And if you have no idea of the nations at your doorstep, then how are you aware of what God is doing around the world and what he wants to do in you and through you and in you and through your church? And once these are in place, then it's a church who's willing to walk alongside their members as they develop mission formation and to help them as they explore what that looks like spiritually and their spiritual development, to explore missional theology and help them begin to develop that. What does it mean to walk alongside financially when the people in your church are called to the nations? And then what does the practical equipping look like? So my family and I, my husband Larry is over here, are beneficiaries of a church who fully bought into the send out model and partnered with Restore Hope to send us to Ethiopia in 2016. But the story began long before 2016. And so it began with a church committed to a Great Commission DNA. And at its very basic, it was a pastoral leadership that instilled in the members a focus from self to others. And so it became not about how do I feed myself, how do I grow, how do I meet my needs, but how do I look outward and take the gospel to others? And so a church leadership that was very committed to that, and it was evident that that's what this church was about. And then they provided opportunities to encounter and engage the nations. And so we were in a fairly resourced church, and so there were multiple opportunities to go internationally. You could go to the Global South. You could go to Europe. You could go to Australia. You could go to Canada. And so depending on the context that you felt God might be calling you, there was an opportunity to serve there. And so in 2011, they were doing their first mission trip to Ethiopia, and Larry and I were invited to go. And when we talk about walking alongside members, for us, as single income, stay-at-home family with 2 children, it was financial provision to go on that trip. And it truly changed our lives. Everybody says, I went on the mission trip and it changed my life, but it truly did. Changed the trajectory of our life and what God wanted to do with that. And the church was willing to walk alongside us in that. And just to be very clear, after the first 2 trips that we made, and we thought, well, God might be stirring us in this direction, we went to one of our pastors on staff who had been at the church for probably 20 years at that point and said, would the church ever consider sending missionaries? And the answer was, no, that's not the model we do at all. But they were open to walking alongside. And the further our family walked into that call, and the further God opened doors in the church for the church to be a part of that concept and that mindset began to shift. And Restore Hope was a big player in that, to help the church move from we send through an outside organization to we are empowered to send ourselves, and we can send our workers out. And that included walking us through seminary training, and that might not be the fit for all sent out workers, but all need equipping in some format, helping us plan a budget, helping us support the church in coming alongside of us, giving us opportunity to speak in Sunday school classes and in worship services, mentoring us through every step of the process, commissioning us, and then staying invested and involved as we launched overseas. So we went from a church that didn't have that model at all to one that in 4 years was sending out. And so very much a model that your church could adopt and be a part of. Now, traditionally, there have been some challenges with U.S. workers going into other cultures, and to be very honest with you, those challenges do still exist in this aspect of polycentric sending. There are financial resources that must be invested in sent out workers. There are periods of preparation, whether that's theological education or spiritual development, perhaps skills and training that they need to maybe to go in as a business's missions entry into the field where they're going. It might be vision trips that pastors or advocacy teams take alongside those workers to look for opportunities. So it does require time and preparation. On the field, there will definitely be culture and perhaps language acquisition that needs to occur in those first phases of launching that might delay full-time engagement once they're there. We do see barriers when we send foreign workers onto the field, cultural barriers that they have to overcome, again, language barriers, maybe fighting against that contextualized gospel that has too many Western influences and really needing to shed that to present an authentic gospel to the people that they have gone to. And then just acceptance of strategy, on both parts, both the host culture welcoming in a foreign worker, and then our foreign worker having to let go of their strategies and adopt new strategies as it fits the culture that they've gone into. And as the climate changes, we are seeing limited access globally for U.S. passport holders. And so this may limit some sent-out workers to the places that they can go in the world. However, there are also enormous benefits, particularly for the U.S. church who chooses to engage in sending out workers. We have a high church engagement when a church sends a worker out. And this comes through the opportunity to financially support and take part in God's mission through our financial resources, certainly in covering them in prayer and walking alongside them as they go through the process, serving as advocates, and then just maintaining that personal connection. A sent-out worker will be a church member who is deeply invested in your church, and your church members will be deeply invested in them. And so a high level of engagement for your church, many opportunities for your church to mobilize to the field, whether this is sending short-term teams to engage with them, engaging with them via Zoom on a Sunday morning or in a prayer group. We certainly hosted many short-term teams that came to us in Ethiopia, but also teams on the ground here in the U.S. through our church that would partner with us in projects. And so we had teens raise money for water wells, and Sunday school classes sponsor household water filtration systems, and women sewing on a weekly basis for our women's ministry and hygiene products. And so many opportunities for your church to come alongside and put their hands to the work as well. And then finally, we see an incredible opportunity to fan the flame of discipleship and growth when a church sends out a worker. The personal witness of God calling out an individual or calling out a family into his service has a powerful impact on the spiritual development of the people watching. And so I know in our home church, and Restore Hope can testify to this in churches in our network, as a church engages in sending out, there is a raising up within the church of God's people to move in spiritual formation, to move in missional living and engagement across the board. And so God has an incredible way of stirring the entire church when one worker is sent out.
So while we acknowledge that sending out is possibly the most common theme that we're used to for mission sending, we also want to think creatively. As Cindy said, the nations are coming to us. So I want to share just a couple of facts just in Texas alone that you may not be aware of. Texas is home to approximately 421 different people groups. Houston is home to more than 90 languages and approximately 13 unreached people groups. The DFW area is home to 420 diaspora people groups and 12 significantly unreached people groups. That's a lot. And as Cindy said, our city alone, Arlington, is the fourth most diverse city in Texas. In the U.S., which is crazy. We're not even the largest in Texas. But the nations are coming to us, and it's very clear that there's a need for our churches to get creative in opening our eyes to what's around us. We have to get creative in evangelizing in our own neighborhoods and those around us of differing ethno-linguistic and cultural identities. And it may require your church to get creative in how to reach the lost just around your neighborhood. So I want to read just a brief case study that I wrote that reflects a story of an individual who is a part of the Restore Hope Network. And just to remind you, Send In is sending indigenous witnesses from other nations to unreached people groups in North America or your surrounding context. So here's a case study for us. Your church has a heart for the unreached people groups in your neighboring community. All of your evangelism efforts have come up short thus far due to language and cultural barriers. Then you meet Amir. Amir is a Jesus follower who came to the U.S. as an asylum seeker. Due to the persecution for his faith in Iran, he fled to Turkey on a temporary visa. There he planted a church that grew to about 80 members. Amir and his family appealed to the U.S. consulate in Istanbul and were granted asylum status in the U.S. He was granted a green card, and he and his family, as well as his extended family, are living in one small apartment. He is currently an Uber driver. Amir is a natural leader and feels called to reach his own people group for Christ. He is already interconnected with Farsi speakers in your local community and lives in the neighborhood adjacent to your church. He has inroads to Farsi speakers locally and globally, which your church does not currently possess. He has been discipling Farsi speakers online in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Turkey. Although Amir is working, he and his family desire to spend more time focused on sharing the gospel with Farsi speakers and helping to establish a base of ministry in Turkey. Amir has no significant Christian community in the U.S. and has a limited ability to fundraise. How could your church come alongside Amir or someone like Amir in healthy ways to enable and empower him to evangelize and disciple the Farsi community here in your neighborhood and around the world? It's important to remember that just because, as Cindy said, individuals are transplanted here, and while they may change their clothes and look like their neighborhood, they are still culturally very different. They celebrate different holidays. They celebrate different religious communities. Everything they do, even though they may seem on the outside assimilated, on the inside they're not. There are many Farsi speakers in the communities in various nations, especially Afghanistan. And so in order to reach those unreached people groups, sometimes the best avenue, like Amir, is a Jesus follower within them who can help guide and lead your church in the ways that is culturally and contextually appropriate for this people group. And as you think about your church and people like Amir, is that something that your church would be able to think creatively about in supporting and equipping someone like Amir? Now, there are certain challenges to this particular method. The first one, church awareness. Is your church aware of the people around you? in the neighborhoods surrounding your church? Your local communities, are they aware of the unreached people groups? Avenues of connectivity. Do they have inroads? Do they have connections with local leaders already within those people groups? Financial sustainability. Like we mentioned, these individuals can come in as outsiders, and they may or may not have the capacity for fundraising or even employment. And then creating a church that is culturally and contextually appropriate. Is your church, do you have the ability in your church to reach these people groups in a way that makes sense to them culturally? You're not just inviting them into your congregations, into your buildings, but how can you reach them that makes sense from the context in which they came from? It requires you to think creatively. And then, of course, there's ministry opportunities. Do you have your eyes open to see where God is already working around you? And then you just join him. How is he already reaching these peoples? How is he already utilizing the local leaders? And just join alongside them. Locating the natural leaders, empowering and enabling them to begin reaching their communities in a larger capacity. And then church education. Your church will learn more about the population around your neighborhoods just by educating itself. And there's different resources, and I think Sam's going to talk about some of them, just where your church can learn who lives next door to you. And are you willing to adapt in a way that's effective and healthy in order to reach those people?
Our third branch of polycentric sending is send within. And so this is sending same culture workers to their own people. And predominantly we see that through our Restore Hope work as national partners already living in their own context, and we are coming alongside and supporting them. So again, Lasan will tell us that 60% of unreached peoples live in countries closed to American workers. 60% of unreached people. We are seeing rapid growth of Christianity in the global south, particularly in Africa and Asia, where we have an estimated 1.15 billion Christians currently this year in 2025. And so what this tells me is the fields are ripe for the harvest, but U.S. workers may not be the right workers for all of those fields. And so as U.S. churches, we need to start looking at additional models of sending. So how do we adopt a send within model within our churches? Well, the first is we have to recognize the need. And congratulations, if you looked at that list of workshops at 1 o'clock today and you chose this one, then you are already there. You already recognize that that sending needs to be multifaceted within our churches. So great job. The second thing is educating the congregation. And so this is a new model for most people. If we were not fully engaged in the missional world, it would be a new model for us. It may be a new model for you this morning. And so as we are working to establish that Great Commission DNA, it's giving our churches various opportunities and models to latch onto. Yeah. Along with that is engaging the nations. And what I mean by that is really ascribing value and worth to people of different cultures and people groups than our own. When we were first on the field in Ethiopia, even before we moved there, we'd taken our family for a summer, and we were engaging in ministry, and it was nap time, and I had a 2-year-old, and he was not where he wanted to be at nap time, and he was crying, and I had Oromo mothers who did not speak my language, but were coming up, offering me solutions to calm him down, and I thought, they are just like me. They are mothers like me who want the best for their babies, and we may be doing that in different contexts with different resources, but they are just like me. And our churches need to know that peoples of other cultures are just like we are. They are valuable. They are made in God's image. Resources and education do not determine our value or our usefulness in the work of the Lord. And we can do this by highlighting indigenous ministries, by, yes, focusing on sent out workers, focusing on sent in workers, but also ascribing value and dignity to indigenous work being hosted by national workers. And finally, we can empower indigenous believers. And so I'm going to share a case study with you in just a moment of someone who God was calling out or calling to his own people, and he didn't even know it in the beginning. He had not been taught a Great Commission DNA. And so it was our privilege to walk alongside him and see him develop that within himself and realize how God could be using him. So empowering them through helping them develop that DNA that we're also working to instill in our own churches, and then supporting them to fulfill what God is calling them to do. In a place where resources may be limited, being willing to come alongside and be that support system. So I want to share a mentee story with you. So when our family moved to Ethiopia through our home church and through Restore Hope, after working in the community and really working to identify the felt need, really felt that God was leading us toward a water development ministry, which in this particular context and government meant walking through all the procedures to establish an international NGO. And so to have legitimacy for the work and to abide by regulations. And one of those regulations was hiring a finance director. And God led us to a mentee. He is an incredibly gifted child of God. A mentee is trilingual, so fluent in English and fluent in the 2 languages of our people group. He is an Oromo person, like our people group, a little bit more resourced than the people we work with in a rural context, has had a few more advantages, but intuitively understands them because he is them. His family comes from the same area that they come from. He understands their background. He is a learner, incredibly humble, willing to be open to what God wants to teach him, and compassionate, extremely compassionate towards the lost and towards those who are less resourced than he is. And so on paper, a mentee was our finance director, but you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And so he started coming out with us on trips to the countryside, predominantly in the beginning as a translator, because we needed someone who could speak all 3 languages and help us navigate. But a mentee is a natural bridge builder. And so he can go into a government office and comfortably have a conversation with the official behind the desk. He can sit down in a mud hut and listen to a woman who has been abandoned by her husband and is trying to care for 4 children and identify with her and connect with her. And so just an incredible bridge builder. And so when we started teaching, we relied on him more and more. And we started out by telling the story and he would translate. And then we started out telling him the story ahead of time and then he would tell it on his own. And finally we just said, do you want to just go out and tell the story? And we figured out over time that he didn't really need us. He was, in fact, sometimes we were a hindrance to what God could do in that place. And a mentee was a much better ambassador on his own. Sometimes we were a distraction where he could walk right into a community and share the gospel and people would come to faith because they weren't so concerned with what an outsider was doing there. And so after 5 years, when God called us back to the U.S., a mentee took over our roles. He was already doing them anyway. And he has become an ambassador to the Oromo people on behalf of Restore Hope, but on behalf of the gospel, really. And praise God for that, because a month after we moved home, COVID hit Ethiopia, and the world shut down, as you well know. And on the heels of COVID, Ethiopia entered a civil war. And on the heels of that, the rebel armies that had always been working within our people group moved into our area. So currently, this area is not accessible to Westerners, but a mentee can still go out. And the gospel is still being preached because God raised up an Oromo person to go to Oromo people. And so we celebrate that. We thank God for that what he started has not fallen by the wayside because circumstances change in the world. So engagement strategies for moving your church into a send within aspect of missional sending. First, you want to look for connection points. And Cindy referenced this as she talked about accountability. We would vet a sent out worker before we put them on the field. We would vet a send in worker before we release them into neighborhoods under our church's name. We also need to vet a send within worker. And so some of the most secure ways to do this would be to work through existing North American missionaries, existing mission organizations, or reputable, long-standing indigenous organizations that are already working on the field. And so I would encourage you to start with known entities and allow them to make connection points with you, for you. We want to focus on transparency. So yes, this is a worker or an organization that is financially transparent, that has good communication practices, that will offer regular reports, and that has broad oversight and accountability. So you never want one person doing all of your communication with you, but to have multiple inroads into these ministries that you can, that you're able to view and keep a pulse on what's going on. We want to find work that is indigenous and sustainable. And so by indigenous, we mean homegrown, not work that is born out of Western concepts and Western strategies, but work that is locally driven. National partners are leading out, and we are supporting them. And they're able to continue without Western input. Now, the story I shared with you, absolutely in the beginning, it was Western driven. And yet we have seen God shift that model. And it's so exciting to me that I don't send messages to a mentee and say, would you do this, this, and this? But it's him sending back to me saying, I would really love to start this, or I feel God leading me in this direction, or I went out today and I did this. And I just get to encourage and praise God for what he's doing. And then I think one of our most important strategies for our U.S. churches is frequent exposure. Unlike the other three models that you see today, your church may never have any direct contact with your worker on the field. Perhaps they've gone on a short-term team and had the opportunity to meet this worker. Perhaps they can use technology to message back and forth. But predominantly, this will be a face, a name, and a ministry that you have to promote to the church, that you have to keep at the forefront so that the investment is there and the commitment remains. Incredible benefits, though, with the send within strategy. We get a purely contextualized gospel, a gospel that is not eroded by Western beliefs or Western ideology, but is an authentic gospel in this culture. We get teaching from same culture believers, indigenous worship, so worship that's not Western songs that have been translated into native languages, but worship that can really come from the heart because it matches what they've always known and what they love. And their meetings, their church services, their leaderships can be contextualized to their culture. I put fewer barriers and immediate enculturation, but honestly, we could say no enculturation. These are workers who share the culture, share the language, and that goes alongside with consistent familiar presence. They live in these communities. They are these communities. And so the gospel gets to go out with very few barriers and very few instances of instability. As the climate changes around the world, these workers are there to stay. This is their hometown. And finally, we get to empower believers around the world to fulfill their calling. Our family has loved watching a mentee step into the leadership role in our nonprofit. But the greatest joy is seeing God raise him up to his own people. And that realization that he has developed, that God is calling me, that I am useful in his service. And we get to empower him to do that, and we get to make it possible for him to do that and fulfill the calling that God has given him.
So the sister of sending within is sending near. So the gospel witnesses to bear witness of Christ among similar cultures. So why is this such a need? There are frontier people groups, which are the hardest to reach subset of unreached people groups, defined as having 0.1% or fewer Christian adherents and no clear, sustainable gospel movement, leaving virtually no chance to hear about Jesus from within their people group. Roughly 1/4 of the world, about 2 billion people, live in these frontier people groups. So it is a huge need that our churches even consider and know about this need and the possibility of sending near. So I want to read a case study that I wrote with one of our local partners in West Africa who we have worked with for many years, and I've worked alongside him and love him very dearly. So I want to just read this to you as a sample of what this sending near could look like. Restore Hope has assisted a church to send cross-cultural workers into West Africa to engage in medical ministry, dentistry, church planting, and discipleship. Working as outsiders, the evangelism, church planting, and discipleship aspects of their calling were not progressing as they had hoped. After several years with little gospel progress, they were introduced to an African church leader named Emmanuel. His church was sending out their own evangelists and church planters. These ordinary men and women were filled with extraordinary power. They were sharing the gospel across tribal lines among some of the most difficult and gospel-resistant people in their nation. 12 unreached people groups were being met with the gospel by this band of 100 African evangelists. Following the lead of local leaders, the Restore Hope worker brought his wisdom, skills, and resources alongside these local near-culture witnesses. In connection with their local partner, we now see thousands of people coming to Christ each year, with hundreds of church plants being created alongside this growth. The U.S. sending church was transformed. They came to understand that reaching the UPGs in this nation and in neighboring nations where people groups spilled across the borders was most effectively accomplished by these near-culture witnesses. The U.S. church and its residential workers have committed themselves to seek healthy ways of fueling the work of this African church planting network. So the sent workers are partnering alongside near-culture witness. And once they did that, they saw the explosion of church plants and people coming to know Christ. So, reasons a church should consider near-culture sending. Why would your church consider this as an option? Government restrictions, as Megan mentioned. We're not able to get into many countries now, and it's lessening more and more. The religious barriers to outsiders. Cultural access and adaptability. It takes much longer, as Megan was witnessing to, for us to adapt into Western cultures. They can just walk right in and have no barrier. Linguistic advantages. Many times they know multiple languages, just like a mentee. They can walk into the neighboring tribe and still communicate, whereas the send out method may take 2 years for language acquisition. Or longer, if at all. And then the remoteness. These areas with the frontier people groups are extremely remote, extremely hard to get to. And sending near, they're just going to the next village in many cases. They're used to it. They're used to walking everywhere. Then we have challenges with sending near. Cultural similarity does not always equal cultural understanding. There's long-standing tribal, political, or religious tensions that can create distrust even within tribal barriers. So it's important for us to acknowledge that as well. Limited financially. Many near-cultural missionaries come from developing or economically challenged regions that lack sustainable resources and networks. Persecution and social pressure. Conversion background may make them targets within their own governments. Religious hostility and national suspicion are things that we need to be aware of as well. But, of course, there are ministry opportunities and benefits to sending near. Like I've mentioned several of these: language, obviously, cross-cultural bridge building. Just like the sending within, sending near, they can meet those barriers much quicker. They're able to identify them and just overcome them. They have less suspicion just walking in. They can communicate spiritual truths in a locally and meaningful way. They're able to bridge the gospel contextually to these people groups because they're aware of their traditions and what comes naturally in communication with them. And then they utilize holistic efforts. We've seen from many of these stories, they establish an entry point into the communities through humanitarian efforts. Just like in Emmanuel's story, our Western sent missionaries help him establish entry points through medical missions. Medical missions opens up these tribal areas where they're invited to receive care, emergent care, to meet a specific need. And then the evangelists go back and they're welcomed in because they're asking, was your need met? They're checking on the people. And then it opens the door for the gospel presentation in those villages. How can your church engage in these efforts and walk alongside sending near? Theological training is a huge need. You can send and train. Mentorship and discipleship is a huge need. Strategizing holistic ministry efforts without creating dependency. This is one that I love because I have a background in international community development. So walking alongside, sending near witnesses and helping them think about how can we meet these physical needs so you can get to gospel proclamation. Okay, Sam.
So, I'm going to call an audible, like you call an audible in football, get up to the scrimmage line and make a different call. So, implications. Let's talk about the implications for churches. Well, I think our natural inclination is to go toward the priority, right? But, okay, let's come up with a strategy, right? So, right? We've got this, and we get our whiteboard out, and we start drawing arrows, and so on. But yet we fail to pray. Okay, so prayer is absolutely essential before anything else. And on the basis of God's answer to the prayers, then we begin to prioritize. This is a loaded question for you. Can a church do all four of these strategies? A single church do all four strategies? Yeah. What would keep a church from doing all four strategies?
If God didn't tell you to, or if he said no.
Lack of prayer.
Okay, lack of prayer, yeah. God saying
Well,
no.
there's also resource implications. There's having the right people being called to the right things.
Okay. Perhaps you're not living in an international setting or a cosmopolitan setting that would have people from a diverse range of places. Then the having a more diaspora-focused ministry doesn't make sense. Okay? But yet at the same time, it does cause us to question this idea of, can a church do all four of these approaches? And the answer is yes, but not by themselves. It requires partnerships, and partnerships that are healthy and robust, and above all, partnerships that are built upon trust. How do you develop trust with people?
Working with them.
Working with them? It's a lot of time. It's a lot of time. And you know, as a parent, we talk about spending quality time over quantity time. And something that I've learned in parenting is that the quality time really only tends to happen when you've spent quantity time. Okay? Because the quality time emerges the longer you spend time together. And I think the same thing happens with partnerships. If you want to have quality relationships, you have to spend the time together in order to then eventually get to those moments of tremendous quality. Pray for laborers, because a church can pray that God would send others. God, send those laborers. How often is the church praying, Lord, send up from within us that we would be the laborers? The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord. Don't you love it how it says it in the King James? What's the word rather than ask? Beseech. That's not a word that we use all that often these days. Beseech sounds old, but it's basically beg. Beg the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field. Why? Not for our glory, but for God's. And out of all of the things that we can do, there are so many opportunities for us to do ministry. All things being equal, should we not be prioritizing the unreached, those who have not yet heard and may live their entire lives without ever encountering a Christian? And we've heard of the gap in missionary resources, the number of missionary personnel going to the unreached, and the even greater scarcity of financial resources going toward the unreached. We bear a responsibility as church leaders to play our part in changing that dynamic and changing the way in which our churches think and act and what we prioritize. And as a result, we can pray, God, as you send out, would you help us to know what we need to say no to in order for us to more fully say yes to the things that you are calling us to? Can you imagine? God, would you please close the doors that we're not supposed to walk through? Imagine praying that. God, close doors so that those doors that are open, we may more fully see them with our eyes and our hearts would be prepared to go through. And this has been said before by many missions pastors. I was one myself for 9 years. And, you know, get a group of missions pastors together in a room, and there's not a lead pastor around. And what are those mission pastors going to be saying to each other? Gosh, the pastor doesn't preach missions from the pulpit. If we could just have him preach from the pulpit more mission stories. Well, guess what? You can complain all you want all day long, and it doesn't change the reality that it's up to the mission pastor and those who are passionate about missions within the congregation, lay or staff, to lead out and do what you can to help create a snowball. But it is true that unless the pastor is 100% behind the mission effort, especially to reach, to send out, whether it's by any one of these 4 models, but to send out to the unreached, if the pastor's not behind it, It's very difficult for it to take off within a church. Can it? Yes. We all play a role in that. Assessing your strengths and your weaknesses as a church is absolutely necessary in equipping your people. Now, let me say this, because I know this you can kind of stop looking at the slide, okay? This is where I landed in the process of developing our presentation. What I realized is that if you look at all of the material that has been written about missions, 99.9% of it is on which one of the 4 strategies? Sending out. Which means there's a complete lack of resources for the other remaining 3. And of those remaining 3, probably the one that is the least written about, the one that is the most innovative is, take for instance, a church in the United States sends missionaries to Guatemala. The American missionary in Guatemala says, my vision in missions is to equip the Guatemalan church that it is then able to raise up and send missionaries to the 1040 window. Okay? So seeing that as the role of the missionary, folks, that is a relatively new concept. There's so much that we don't know. In fact, there's more that we don't know than we do know. Folks, we get to be on the cutting edge of what God is doing in the world. Is there anything new under the sun? No. We know that there's nothing new under the sun, yet there's a lack of information out there that would allow for Joe Blow in a church to pick up material that would allow him to understand these 3 less dominant paradigms. Okay, so we have some time for Q&A, not very much of it, but any of the questions can be directed at all 4 of us who spoke. Let me throw out this question to you, and that is, where do you start? After you've heard all of this, you go home to your church and you want to employ a more polycentric sending model. Where do you start?
Right.
Pray. And what do you pray for?
Guidance, understanding.
Openness.
You're also praying for people to find their calling.
We could pray we could hear these 4 again.
Why is that?
Huh?
Why is that?
Because I've been a missionary for 40 years and this is one of the best presentations I've ever sat at. I thank all of you, all you 3 ladies and yourself, sir. This has been very good. It's it's right on target with what I see and understand about missions myself. And you know, you're seeing it clear, you're seeing it well. I think you've been spending time with God, and this is the way He's moving today.
And I think with that, we're done. Thank you for that blessing over us.
Thank you.
Yeah. Your blessing was not a prayer, it was a statement that was a prayer. And I thank you for it. God bless.
Are there any other questions before we go? Any other thoughts to share? I think when you said a minute ago, what's new under the sun, is interesting. Before we begin to put these thoughts together for you today, I was just doing a biblical study on models of sending out, sending in, sending within, and sending near within the New Testament. So, of course, sending out, you're thinking of Paul and Barnabas being sent out from Antioch. Sending in, I think about Paul going first to the synagogues. within his own people, even within international context, to go within his own people. Sitting within, Ethiopian eunuch takes the gospel to Ethiopia, and you can research the history of that. But if you asked an Ethiopian that question, they would tell you the story and identify him by name. And then sending near, I think about Acts chapter 2, and all of those Jews who were living throughout the known world, whether they were creeds or there's a whole long list of all the people who came into Jerusalem that day who heard the gospel, had language, had place, had ability to access peoples in a near culture kind of way, and that were dispersed. And so these are not new models. These are things that God has been using from day one in the New Covenant era and in the latter days. So your churches can do that as well. May God bless you as you go. Thank you.